Hello and welcome. Today we will study about the life and times of Jonathan Swift. So Jonathan Swift is an English author who is born in Dublin, and he's famous to be a prose satirist, although he's written a number of poems as well. So the notable works that he is known for are The Tale of a Tub, The Battle of Books, Gulliver's Travels, The Modest Proposal. He's written a lot of poems as well as pamphlets and commentaries on the politics of his times. And he belongs to the Augustan age, which is the 18th century. So he's born in Dublin in Ireland in 1667, and he's the son of an English lawyer. His father had died much before he was born, and he was pretty much abandoned by his mother. So he was taken care of by his uncles, and he grew up in Ireland, attending the Trinity College at the age of 14. And he stayed there for a long time until 1688. And in 1688, when he's 21 years old, this is the time when Roman Catholicism, because they are Protestants, there are some problems in Ireland, and he has to move to England. And to give you a little bit of a context of that time, this is the time of the Glorious Revolution, which is also called the Bloodless Revolution of 1688 in English history. And this is the time when James II, who is a Catholic king, he is deposed. And for Irish people, because they are Roman Catholic, this becomes a problem, and they pose a threat to the English people who are there in Ireland. So for the time being, people like Swift have to move out from Ireland. And when he moves out, he moves to Sir William Temple's house. Sir William Temple is an English politician who was also a very distant relative for Swift, and he moves out to Sir William Temple's office, and he works with him as his secretary. Sir William Temple works for the Whig Party, and he writes for the Whig Party, and for most of his time Swift does jobs of typing out and writing for him. And Swift was his secretary for most of the period from 1689 until Temple's death in 1699. I'm sorry, this is not the time Swift could have typed anything. He would write things for Sir William Temple. And it was here that Swift met Esther Johnson, who was also known as Stella. And in Swift later's poetry, she's a child right now, but in Swift's later poetry, she appears, and it seems that Swift and Stella were lifelong partners after Stella had grown up. And it is during this time that Swift writes The Battle of Books on the theme of ancient versus modern learning. And here books in the King's Library come alive and fight a literal battle. And it is published as a prologue of a later work, which is called The Tale of a Tub. And Swift leaves the final decision of choosing what is the superior kind of learning for the reader. And I'll just show you a picture of The Battle of Books. This is literally books fighting a battle between one another, and a battle between ancient versus modern learning. So William Temple died in 1699, and Swift wrote a heartfelt piece on his work on him. But after Temple's death, he does not have any other occupation. He tries, but he fails, and he has to return to Ireland. Meanwhile, since he has written a lot of work, done a lot of work already, he has begun to write satires on political and religious corruption. And this is the time A Tale of a Tub and The Battle of Books is published, which is 1704, and this builds his reputation as a writer. And right now he is a junior Anglican clergyman, which basically means that he's working for the English Church. Now let me tell you a little bit about The Tale of a Tub. The Tale of a Tub is actually a critique of other religious branches, but it turns out that Swift in general was critical of any absurdities in religion, so he seems to be critical of Anglican Church as well. But The Tale of a Tub is tells the story of three brothers. These three brothers have inherited codes from their father. The father represents God, and these three brothers represent three contesting branches of Christianity, namely the Roman Catholic Church, the Protestant or the Puritan Church, and the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is the middle path, and he seems to have more faith in the Anglican Church much more than the others. And these brothers have their father's will, uh, which is represented by the Bible, to guide them. And it is written in 1694 and in 1697, and it is published in 1704. And Swift, being a clergyman in the Church of Ireland, he wants to show some allegiance to the Church of England, but this work is so critical of religion in general, he is reviewed critically. Eventually, he starts working for the Church of Ireland, which is actually the branch of the English Church. And this is the background picture, is actually the picture of St. Patrick's Cathedral, where he worked for most of his life in Ireland. So he is a clergyman. He's a member of the Irish branch of the Anglican Church, and he's a militant defender of a church. But he also he's continued to be a defender of the Anglican Church through his life. So just to tell you a little bit about his religious beliefs, he is an Orthodox, but he's also believed in personal liberty and rationality, clearly because he's in the 18th century, and this is the Augustan age, which has a lot of respect for classical learning. So Swift is also one of them. He believes in but he also believes that mankind in general has divisive tendencies, and this has led to the decay of Christianity itself. And so the truth has been therefore mishandled and corrupted not by religion but by man. And he adhered therefore to the tenets of the Anglican Church, and he saw the church as the Anglican Church more than anything else, as the force of rationality and moderation. And he also writes such pieces as the Tale of a Tub, where he eulogizes the Church of England in order to rise high up in his social class, and also because his own ambitions are involved with the rise of the Anglican Church. So 1710 to 1714 he stays in London, and he works for the Tories. Although Sir William Temple was a Whig and he'd written 4 Whigs, now he is working for the Tories. Now he becomes the chief propaganda officer for the Tories. We know that by now his work is being accepted well, and he's known to be a good writer. But in 1714 the regime changes, and George the First comes to power, and he has to now return to Ireland, and he has to now just stay in the St. Patrick's Cathedral, and eventually he would become a very he would talk about Ireland and the problems of Ireland. From 1720 onwards, he becomes very popular in Ireland, essentially because of his many pamphlets. He's famous for his following quote, and he says, quote, "Ireland would never be happy till a law were made for burning everything that came from England except their people and their coals." So Swift argued that the English trade restrictions were actually proving to be harmful even for distorting Irish development, and it was also not letting the Irish economy to flourish. And despite these such words said about Ireland and England, he would always see himself as an Englishman. But because he's a defender of Ireland, he is very popular in Ireland, and the Irish consider him to be one of their early patriots. So, and to give you a little more background about the Ireland and Britain problems, Ireland had been controlled by British for almost 500 years, and the Stuart regime had been Protestant, and they had put the mostly Roman Catholic Church under themselves. So despite the fact that Swift had belonged to the minority English aristocracy in Ireland, he is still considered to be Irish patriots, and his modest proposal, which I will talk about in a bit, his modest proposal is considered to be one of the most effective satires written about the condition of the poor people in Ireland. Now, this is the time, since 1720s is the time when much of his good work is published. This is the time he's also publishing Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver's Travels is, as we know, known to be a children's book, but it is not meant to be a children's book. It is much more than that. So this work is actually an allegory, and Swift's views on human society and culture are actually not very pleasing to many people. And he says that human society and culture can be very absurd, and his views are reaffirmed through the character of Lemuel Gulliver, who is the protagonist of this novella. And so Gulliver travels to various foreign lands, and these lands would be Lilliput, Brobdingnag, Laputa, and Houyhnhnms. And with all these places, he sees the society functions in very absurd ways. And for instance, in the land of Lilliputians, he sees that they create hierarchies just based on what kind of heels they wear. And similarly with Laputa, he sees how the pursuit of intellect alone can be against common sense, and it can also be fatal. So, but finally, when he comes back to his own land, he finds that he has started disliking the humankind itself. So this whole novella is very critical of the human attitudes, and it tries to open people's eyes towards the various absurdities of the society in general. Until mid 1730s, he writes a number of pamphlets. He also writes a number of poems towards the end of his life. And he is in 1742, unfortunately, he is declared as having unsound mind, but we now feel that it may not, his mental condition may not be as bad, and he dies in 1745. Since he worked most of his life as a clergyman of the Church of Ireland, we still have a big statue of Swift in the St. Patrick's Cathedral. He is also known to have formed the MARTINUS SCRIBLERUS Club, and when he would visit from Ireland to England, he had developed a lifelong friendship with people like Alexander Pope, John Gay, who were also his contemporaries, and who were also kind of stalwarts of the 18th century English writings. And so they together formed the MARTINUS SCRIBLERUS Club, which was basically meant to ridicule pretentious and scholarly jargon of people who just pretended that they are learned a lot, but it's all untrue learning. Towards the end, what does Swift stand for? Although he is supposed to be a misanthrope, but scholars now have started looking at him as not so much of a misanthrope. His deadpan style of delivering humor, which we see in Modest Proposal, makes us also believe that he has a very sharp sense of humor, and we also see this in many of his poems that he writes, and we will just discuss these poems as well in a bit. We see that the humor in his poetry in his later years, and also critics have now started rethinking whether he was a misanthrope at all. And he also suffered from a rare disorder of the inner ear, which was the Meniere's disease, and this can actually can be potentially incapacitating, and you can have episodes of vertigo, hearing loss, and fullness of the ear. And he had faced this almost through his life, and at this point this particular disease was not detected, and this particular reason could also have been one of the reason of the fact that he was later on considered to be of unsound mind, but it could be something as detectable as the Meniere's disease, which is a disease of the ear. So Swift, the other part of Swift's life was the presence of Ireland in his writings. Swift blamed Ireland's backward state chiefly to the blindness of the English government, but he also insistently called attention to the things that Irish themselves might need to change amongst themselves. And in another of his works of Irish works is called Drapier's Letters, which is also popular, and this is a collective name given to a set of 7 letters which was published from 1724 to 1725 to address the imposition of a different kind of a currency for the Irish people, and this was again therefore written for a political purpose. Now I'll just talk about the Modest Proposal, which is again considered, apart from Gulliver's Travels, it's Modest Proposal which is considered to be one of his major and most important works. So the Modest Proposal, which has a long title, which is called the Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People from being a burden to their parents or country for making them beneficial to the public. Basically, this is a satirical essay written anonymously initially in 1729, and this essay just very sarcastically and ironically suggests that since Ireland has so many poor people and so many poor children, these poor children should just be eaten by the rich, which would help the country's economic troubles to be ended. So he is being extremely ironic about the problems that Irish people are facing at this time, and so he's using satire, he's using hyperbole to mock the heartless attitude of the people, of the English people towards the Irish. And he's not just a prose writer, he's also writing poetry, and as we know, in the 18th century poetry was the main medium for people to write and express themselves. So he is famous to have written his own a poem about himself and about his own, perhaps his own death. So he talks about the verses on the death of Dr. Swift, and he says, and this particular poem is also very funny. He says that for any poet to imagine that his contemporaries would be better than him would be difficult, so he imagines everyone else to just go to hell. So that's a funny poem that he's written. And another funny poem that he's written is a birthday poem for Stella, and this is very playful, and it makes fun of the fact that Stella is 34 years old and perhaps she's also fat. So he's despite making fun of her, this poem is still very adorable, and the way he talks about Stella feels that it comes from a place of genuine affection. A little bit about the relationship between this person Stella and Swift. The biographer of Swift has alleged and perhaps found out that Stella and Swift were related, and in fact Sir William Temple, who Swift had actually visited, was also a relative, and the relationship between Stella and Swift may have been of uncle and niece, and which is why they could never marry despite having a very close bond with one another. So his biographer, which is the latest biography, believes that Swift in fact was related to Sir William Temple, and that Stella, allegedly being Temple's illegitimate daughter, was Swift's niece, meaning that they would not be able to get married despite having a close relationship. And this particular biography is by Leo Damrosch. So Swift's legacy stays. He has Gulliver's Travels has now been is an international children's novel across cultures. Many films, cartoons have been made, and Swift's life has always been a point of discussion. Over time, many have written biographies about Swift, and much of it is now in the public domain. Thank you. We'll see you next time.